Well, thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for your friendship and your strong leadership when it comes to defending this country. And I want to thank Pete Hegseth for his leadership standing up for our veterans and the important voice he is on the need to stand by the men and women of the military. And I want to thank each of y'all for coming together, for being at this conference, and for focusing on issues of national security and issues of foreign policy and the proper role for America. Because, there are times in our nation's history that are inflection points. There are times that are points of crisis. I think the late 1970s, 1980 was one of those times. I think right now today is another one of those times. And I think there is a critical need, both at home and abroad, to restore America's leadership in the world. Just a little over a week ago, Congressman Adam Kinzinger and I were up in Halifax at a defense conference in Canada. There were about 60 nations there, a lot of very close friends and allies of the United States, heads of states, foreign ministers, defense ministers. And it was a bipartisan delegation from both houses that went up that met with all of these various folks, and we had bilateral meetings, one after the other after the other. What was absolutely striking in meeting after meeting after meeting is virtually every one of our allies, what they would say is that they would plead with us. They'd say, where is America? What has happened? There's a reason America has been called the indispensable nation. For the last 6 years, what we've seen is we've seen America recede from leadership in the world. And that's created a vacuum. And into that vacuum have stepped nations like Russia, like China, like Iran, and it has not made the world a safer place. Meeting after meeting with our allies, they were all but pleading. These problems are insoluble without American leadership. And unfortunately right now, as you look across the globe, the failures of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy are manifest. It's almost like the whole world is on fire right now. It seems there is not a portion of the world where security, where our relationship with our allies, where our ability to contain our enemies, to defeat our enemies, it seems there's not a region in the world where that hasn't gotten worse. Well, I guess Antarctica's doing okay. But leading from behind doesn't work. Leading from behind, we are seeing the consequences when America recedes and hides from the mantle of leadership. So what does it mean? What does reasserting American leadership in the world mean? I'm going to suggest there are three things we should focus on. The purpose of this gathering is to lay out and discuss what a positive, renewed American leadership in the world would look like. Number one, we should be a clarion voice for freedom. Never underestimate the power of the bully pulpit of America. There's a tremendous tradition of America speaking out and giving voice to the hopes, to the aspirations to live free across the world. Some months ago, I was in Israel meeting with Natan Sharansky, the famed Soviet dissident. He shared with me how when he was in the Soviet gulag, people would pass from cell to cell notes. Did you hear what President Reagan said? Evil empire, ash heap of history. Tear down this wall. One of the most striking and inexplicable aspects of the last 6 years is the almost complete absence of American leadership speaking out for freedom. I have to say, when you visit with Republicans or Democrats in the Senate, almost to a person, they cannot explain it. Pastor Saeed Abedini, an American citizen wrongfully imprisoned in Iran for now over 2 years for sharing his Christian faith. Right now, our State Department is busy negotiating with Iran while an American languishes in prison. the President of the United States should speak up with absolute clarity and say, release Pastor Saeed right now. Miriam Ibrahim, a woman in Sudan who was sentenced to receive 100 lashes and then hang by the neck until dead for the crime of her Christian faith. Miriam is married to an American, Daniel, who lives in New Hampshire. She's got 2 little babies. Martin is about 2 years old, and her baby Maya, who was born in a Sudanese prison camp. All across the world, people spoke out in support of Miriam Ibrahim. And yet, stunningly absent from those voices was the President of the United States. I will tell you, one of the senior officials in this administration, I practically begged, look, the President isn't listening to what I'm saying. Can you convince the President, stand up on the world stage and say to the government of Sudan, to torture and murder a young woman for her religious faith is wrong. Now, I'm happy to say the voices of leadership were so strong across the world that Sudan could not stand against that. And they released Miriam. And she is now back in America, back in New Hampshire, free. But that was done without American leadership. Or if you look down to Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez, opposition leader there, young man, leading the effort to free his people, to bring back individual liberty, democratic government, to liberate the people of Venezuela from a failed socialist dictatorship. The administration right now in Venezuela has imprisoned him, is shooting and torturing freedom fighters. Mr. Lopez is in his prison cell, is subjected to degradation, is subjected to prison guards throwing feces and urine on him. And I have a simple question. Where is America? Where is the President standing up and shining a light? America can be a clarion voice for freedom, and that has been lacking. The first element of a new American leadership in foreign policy is rediscovering the voice of America to speak out for freedom. Now, the second critical element is resolutely defending U.S. national security. The singular failure of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy has been a failure to focus on the vital national security interest of the United States. Foreign policy instead seems to focus on almost everything else. It seems to focus on photo ops and press release. It focuses on international norms. It focuses on international law. But our foreign policy should focus like a laser on the national security interest of the United States of America. And we should not shy from defending those. In my view, if and when military action is called for, it should be directed towards defending the national security interest of this nation. Now, we have always been reluctant to engage in military conflict, and we should remain reluctant to engage in military conflict. But if and when we have to, it should be with a clear stated objective up front. We should go in with overwhelming force, and then we should get the heck out. It is not the job of our military to produce democratic utopias across the world. It is not the job of our military to transfer foreign nations into Switzerland. It is the job of our military to hunt down our enemies and kill them before they kill us. And that is the focus that has sadly been lacking for the last 6 years. Let's take 3 examples of the failures of the current policy and what a sound policy would look like. Let's talk about Russia, ISIS, and Iran. If you look at Russia, this administration began by vaunting the Russian reset. They knew so much better that the way you deal with Putin who I might note is not a complicated guy. He is a KGB thug. But I talked about a photo op foreign policy. The foreign policy was all manifested in showing up with a giant red button that said reset, misspelled in Russian. Okay, this is also a foreign policy where their great insight was described as don't do stupid stuff. Although it was said a little more profane than that. But I'm cleaning it up for the cameras. So what happened? Listen, when you're dealing with a dictator or a thug, they don't respect weakness. It doesn't work. So, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the response of the president was, well, I think Putin's lawyers are telling him different things than my lawyers are telling him. You literally cannot make this stuff up. If Saturday Night Live were parodying a hapless, ineffective president, they couldn't make things up worse. Look, just a few months ago, Jimmy Carter criticized this president for being weak on foreign policy. Holy cow! But what does that say? That he thinks it's a disagreement between lawyers? It's not a disagreement between lawyers. It is a thug exercising raw power. Now, what should our response have been? In my view, now listen, no one wants to see direct military conflict between the United States and Russia. The two largest nuclear stockpiles in the world, no one wants to see a shooting war between those nations. But we discovered in the Cold War there are all sorts of tools of power short of direct military conflict. When Putin invaded Crimea, in my view, the first thing we should have done is announced we were going forward with installing the anti-ballistic missile batteries in Poland and the Czech Republic. They had been scheduled to go into effect in 2009, and President Obama and Hillary Clinton canceled them in an effort to appease Putin. Well, it's now manifestly clear that appeasement didn't work. So the first step should have been to put meaningful consequences. We're going to go through and put the anti-ballistic missile batteries. You know, earlier this year I traveled to Ukraine and Poland and Estonia. And I'll tell you, every one of them were begging, we need help, we need allies. We need something more than paper tigers. But secondly, there were at the time of the invasion 22 applications pending with this administration to export liquid natural gas, LNG. Now, Putin is in many senses a petro-tyrant. In fact, my colleague John McCain has a great phrase. He says, Russia is a gas station with a country attached. But Russia uses its power over energy to blackmail Ukraine and much of Europe. And look, if you're in Ukraine, listen, and you've got the Ukrainian winter coming and Putin has the ability to shut off your gas and leave your citizens freezing in that brutal winter, your ability to stand up is vastly limited. Look, the people of Ukraine are crying out. They want to be with the West. They want to be with Europe. They want to be with America. They don't want to be drawn back into a reassembled Soviet Union. And let's be clear, Putin is perfectly candid about his aspirations. He has said the greatest geopolitical disaster of modern times is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And his objective is to reassemble as much of it as possible. We don't have an administration capable of checking that. What the president should have done when Putin invaded Crimea is stood up that instant and said the federal government is approving all 22 applications to export LNG. Now, what would that have done? Number one, it would have helped the people of Ukraine stand on their own feet free of Russian blackmail. Number two, it would have imposed real meaningful consequences on Russia, on their income. And number three, it would have produced jobs and economic growth here at home. It's as close to a no-brainer as possible, but sadly, That runs afoul of domestic politics in the Democratic Party, because there are some very large donors who write very big checks trying to stop sensible energy policy. So instead, we haven't responded effectively. Let's take ISIS. Just a few months ago, the president announced he had no strategy on ISIS, which surprised precisely 0.0 people on this planet. If you look at what we're doing with ISIS now, it's a bomb here, it's a rocket there. You know, we had a hearing a couple of months ago in the Senate Armed Services Committee. The Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs were testifying. I asked the question, if the military objective were to destroy ISIS, not to weaken them, not to contain them, to destroy them, because they pose a clear and present danger to this country, what would be required from a military perspective to do so in 90 days? General Dempsey's response was, I'm sorry, that's impossible. I said, okay, maybe that time frame is not reasonable. If it cannot be done in 90 days, let me ask you, in your military judgment, what would be required to destroy ISIS? Again, his response, there is no military solution to this problem. The only solution is to change the conditions on the ground so people are not susceptible to radicalism. There is a word for that. It's called nonsense. Look, the answer to ISIS is not expanded Medicaid in Iraq. The objective of our military shouldn't be fundamentally altering the poverty, the conditions on the ground in every country in the world. The focus of our military should be, there are radical terrorists who've declared war on America, who are murdering Americans, who are beheading American journalists, who are pledging to take jihad here and murder Americans here at home. How do we take them out and protect Americans before they take innocent lives, more innocent lives? What was so sad about that hearing is it seemed those questions weren't even being asked. Instead, it was, let's demonstrate we're being tough against ISIS. Let's get some pictures of a bomb dropping here. But not, let's focus on taking them out. And we should be using overwhelming air power in combination with, we've got boots on the ground. We've got boots in the ground with the Kurds, who are ready and willing to fight. The Peshmerga have demonstrated they're effective at fighting, and yet they are fighting with crude weapons against U.S. military hardware that ISIS has seized, and we're right now not effectively arming the Kurds. That makes no sense. If the objective were defeat ISIS, if the objective were defend U.S. national security, we would have a serious, concerted, real bombing campaign, not a photo-op campaign. And we would be using the boots on the ground of the Peshmerga to hunt down and kill the leadership of ISIS. And a third example I will point to is Iran. The single gravest national security threat to the United States right now is the threat of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capability. The deal we are negotiating with Iran, which to the surprise of nobody was delayed 6 months more. I agree with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, this is a very, very bad deal. This is an historic mistake. And I believe we're repeating the mistakes of the 1990s of the Clinton administration, where the Clinton administration led the world relaxing sanctions against North Korea. Billions of dollars flowed into North Korea, and they used that money to develop nuclear weapons. Astonishingly, the Obama administration has recruited the person who led the failed North Korea talks, Wendy Sherman, to be our lead negotiator in the failed Iran talks. Now listen, if your objective is PR, if your objective is a photo op, this is great. Cut a deal with Iran, doesn't matter what the terms are, because you can have a fancy signing ceremony. And eventually you could probably find some piece of paper that someone in Iran will sign. If that is your objective, our conduct makes perfect sense. But if your objective is protecting the national security interest of the United States, what we are doing is stunningly foolish. Because Iran is qualitatively more dangerous than North Korea. North Korea, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, radical, extreme, unpredictable, but fundamentally megalomaniacal narcissists, which means some degree of rational deterrence is possible. Both father and son understood if they ever used a nuclear weapon, that day their regime would end. The danger in Iran with Khomeini and the mullahs, when you have radical religious extremists who glorify suicide, who glorify death, ordinary cost-benefit deterrence doesn't work. That's based on the notion that people don't want to die, don't want their citizens to die. Religious zealots are operating under a different cost-benefit analysis. 72 virgins changes that calculus. Now, if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, in my view, the odds are unacceptably high that Iran would use that nuclear weapon, either over the skies of Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles. And listen, if Iran set off a nuke over Tel Aviv, it would murder vast numbers of Palestinians. And yet what I fear is that to Khomeini and the mullahs, those are perfectly acceptable losses to have the opportunity to annihilate Israel. And by the way, if that sounds hyperbolic because no one in the administration speaks in those terms, in the middle of negotiating this foolish deal, the leadership of Iran tweeted out a step-by-step plan to annihilate Israel. They're not hiding what they're doing. In the middle of negotiating this deal, they transferred Pastor Saeed Abedini from the brutal Evin prison, a terrible place, to the even worse Rajai Shar prison, the worst hellhole in Iran. You know what day they did that? The anniversary of Iran seizing American hostages. What they refer to in Iran as Death to America Day. That wasn't an accident. And yet this administration is like, oh, well, we can still cut a deal, it'll be great. This doesn't make any sense. A foreign policy directed at U.S. national security would follow the path of legislation that I've introduced in the Senate. It would, number one, immediately reimpose sanctions. It would strengthen the sanctions to make them even more crippling, and then it would lay out a clear path for Iran to lift those sanctions. What do we need with Iran? Very simply, more stick, less carrot. Here's what the path would be for Iran lifting the crippling sanctions, which were starting to work. I mean, the irony is the sanctions were working, Iran's economy was crumbling to its knees, and right when it was working, the administration stepped in and said, oh, here, have a few $1 billion. A sensible path would say if Iran wants the sanctions lifted, number one, disassemble all 19,000 centrifuges. Number two, hand over every pound of enriched uranium. Number three, shut down your ICBM program, which, by the way, exists for one purpose only, and that is to carry weapons of mass destruction to America or to our allies. And number four, stop being the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. That would be a sensible policy focused on U.S. national security rather than photo ops. The third and final thing we need to do is we need to stand with the men and women of the military. We need to stand with our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, our Marines. You know, we are getting ready to move into a Pentagon with the 4th Defense Secretary in 6 years. We've had 3 defense secretaries step down, and 2 of them have taken the unprecedented step of writing books detailing chapter and verse the unwillingness of this administration to defend our national security. And I don't know that anyone in this room would be surprised if a 3rd book is forthcoming. What a failure of leadership at a time when the world is on fire, when the national security threats are manifest, and it seems what the administration is looking for is a defense secretary who will follow the orders of a political White House rather than focus on defending the national security interest of this country. We need to be standing with the men and women of our military. I introduced legislation just a couple of weeks ago providing that our soldiers who have been deployed to Africa to fight Ebola should be eligible for combat pay. Any soldier who is subject to a 21-day quarantine, any soldier who is risking his or her life, his or her family's life, with a deadly, terrifying disease, is taking on a risk comparable to the risk of going to combat and risking an enemy bullet. Existing law doesn't allow that. It is my hope that we're going to see some bipartisan agreement in changing existing law so that we can recognize the sacrifices being made by the men and women of the military. We are also, hopefully, in the next couple of weeks, going to be taking up the National Defense Authorization Act. I serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and one of the things that I was pleased to work with my colleague Senator Cornyn on was introducing an amendment to the NDAA that provides that the 14 men and women who were murdered at Fort Hood by Nidal Hasan would be eligible for the Purple Heart. Now, unfortunately, the Defense Department has resisted this. The administration has called Nidal Hasan, who was in communication with radical Islamic terrorists who cried out, Allahu Akbar, as he murdered his fellow soldiers, who is called to ISIS saying he wanted to join ISIS. The administration is contending that what happened at Fort Hood was, quote, workplace violence. That is Orwellian doublespeak. You cannot win a war on radical Islamic terrorism with an administration unwilling to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. Now, the amendment I introduced on Fort Hood, I'm pleased to say, despite the administration's opposition, was unanimously adopted in the Senate Armed Services Committee. Republicans and Democrats came together and said, enough is enough. We need to honor the 14 dead and the 31 who were wounded on this terrorist attack on our home soil. And we also need leadership when it comes to sequestration. Our military leadership have said up and down the chain of command that sequestration is imposing serious costs on the ability to defend this nation. The world is getting more dangerous, not less. And yet the administration's view is it holds the military hostage to jacking up domestic spending. If they can't have more butter, then there will be no guns and no support for the men and women of our military. That's not a responsible position. I'll tell you, earlier this year we had a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. Secretary Hagel was testifying. I was asking about the Pentagon budget, and let's be clear, there is pork in the Pentagon budget. I know this room is astonished to hear that. For example, roughly $7 billion of the Pentagon budget are allocated to alternative fuels. The Navy has an algae fuel program. Taking algae and using it to fuel our ships, they spent roughly $160 million on it. Using conventional fuel would have cost $40 million. So it wasted $120 million. Now, my question to Secretary Hagel, at a time of scarcity, at a time when we are cutting soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines, don't you think it's time to cancel the algae fuel program? And his response, he testified, he said, well, I would agree it is a, quote, luxury. That was his word for this program, was a luxury. And I asked, well, has the Pentagon looked to canceling the luxuries before you forcibly retire captains throughout our armed forces and lose critical years of service and experience that can't be replicated quickly? I'm sorry to say the answer was no. No, we haven't thought about cutting the luxuries. Instead, we're cutting our capacity. We need a foreign policy that focuses on standing with the brave men and women that step forward and sacrifice to defend this nation. That's what the men and women here do. And so I'm pleased just to be with you and say thank you. Thank you for standing up for our great nation. Now is a time of great challenge, but it's also a time of hope. I am optimistic despite how dire things are, because sometimes things have to get really bad to wake people up. And I'm convinced people are waking up all over the country that we want to get back to the American leadership in the world that has produced the Pax Americana. We want to get back to the tradition of who we are as Americans, and I see that happening all over this country, and I'm proud to stand with each of you in continuing that transformation. Thank you.